We are Pro Cannabis Media.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Weed Talk News. I'm Jimmy Young, the founder of Pro Cannabis Media.
And I'm Curt Dalton, the founder of Cannabis.net.
We've got a lot of headlines for you, including a huge drug bust on the Canadian border in upstate New York. And MJBizDaily makes a bold prediction about the cannabis industry's future.
Jimmy, we have lots of headlines from around the country as well. And we're going to kick it off with our good friend, Debra Borchardt of the Green Market Report out of New York.
Thanks, Jimmy and Curt. It's a shortened trading week. Markets will be closed on Friday in celebration of the 4th of July holiday. Well, investors are still pouring money into the cannabis industry despite the challenges for cannabis stocks. This week, Innovative Industrial Properties priced an offering for $225 million. The underwriters also have the option to buy an additional 400,000 shares. And Grow Generation priced their offering. They raised $42 million. They originally only planned to raise $35 million. We also had some news from the pharma side of the industry this week. GW Pharmaceuticals outlined their strategy for their other cannabis drug, Sativex. They plan to use it as a treatment for MS spasticity, PTSD, and spinal cord injuries. Zynerba also had to report, unfortunately, that the results for their drug, Zygel, did not have the amount of positive results they had hoped for in treatment of Fragile X syndrome. And finally, Harborside announced that they will not be able to report their earnings on time. They expect to cease trade order. That will be lifted once the results are published. And that's it for this week. I'm Debra Borchardt with the Green Market Report for Weed Talk News.
Next up, it's Cresco Labs, another one of those multi-state operators. You know, Curt, Debra talked about Innovative Industrial Properties in her report. They're involved with another sales leaseback deal with Cresco Labs for $29 million. Now, $21 million of that goes to tenant improvements of the vertically integrated facility right here in Massachusetts. So, Curt, what is a sales leaseback agreement? How does that work in the cannabis space?
It's a nice way for companies to raise cash and remove the flower touching part of their business so they could list their real estate and their grow houses as into REITs or into some sort of public vehicle to raise money. So basically, they're selling their asset to someone, but they're immediately leasing it back at a favorable rate. But now that new asset is not touching the flower. It's just a landlord. So now it can be listed publicly in more places, and they can kind of put it into different investment vehicles to raise capital.
It's all about that almighty dollar. Anyway, now let's talk a little bit about what other states are doing this week. There's been lots of movement right before the 4th of July holiday. Remember that 4th of July holiday, it all started in Boston. That's where it all began. And speaking of Boston, there's now a second dispensary that has now opened. It's Berkshire Roots in East Boston. They got their commence operations permission from the Cannabis Commission this week. And of course, this is their second dispensary. They also have one in the Berkshires in Pittsfield. So, Curt, once again, another dispensary finally opens in Boston 4 years after voters wanted it.
You know, hopefully they'll have an easier time than our friend Kobe Evans at Pure Oasis, but East Boston means Logan Airport's going to take on a whole new meaning about flying. So all you travelers, it's amazing how they open one up right by the airport like many legal states has, because as you land at Logan, you might be pulling up your Cannabis.net map and finding out where the closest dispensary is, and now you have one right by the airport.
There you go. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Illinois here because their governor, J.B. Pritzker, put a whole bunch of licenses on hold. Now, Illinois has been open for 5 months. They've sold $191 million worth of adult use recreational weed, but the governor wants things to slow down. Does that sound familiar to you, Curt?
Pretty much standard operating procedure, SOP as we like to call it, for every state. There's excitement, there's a big push. Oklahoma has 5,000 dispensaries within a week, and then everybody pulls the reins back in to say, whoa, what's going on? Make sure we're doing it right. So the only concern is there it becomes like the state of Maine, where they approved it 3 years ago, and they have yet to launch their rec. You just want to make sure those delays and those checkpoints aren't extended. But Pritzker has been pretty weed friendly. It's not a situation like Massachusetts. So I don't think it's going to be a big deal in the long run.
There you go. And in some other state news involving cannabis this week, July is here, and that means that Virginia has decriminalized possession of cannabis. And that's a big deal in Virginia because they were one of the tougher states, weren't they?
Yeah, they're a red state traditionally, and the fact that it's the first step, right? It's the baby step, decriminalize it, just so we're not throwing people getting caught with a joint in jail. And then, of course, we're going to work on medical and keep those steps going. But again, SOP, standard operating procedure, decriminalize is your very first step.
All right, New Jersey has lowered the tax rate on medical marijuana. It had been hit with a 6% sales tax, and now they've lowered it to 4%, and it's going in that direction. But there are still advocates that are upset, Curt, that they're actually taxing medicine at all, because if you go to the drugstore and fill a prescription, there is no tax on your whatever drug the doctor gave you.
Yeah, so different states have setups that some do not tax medical, like Massachusetts, and some states do. Obviously, lowering the tax rate is probably due to pressure and cannabis advocacy and patients. You're also trying to compete against the black market and at least make the prices competitive, which is still a long way to go when you're taxing a product already. So.
Hey, let's talk about Arizona. 420,000 signatures. They got it in just in time. So legalization will be on the ballot in November in Arizona. And that happened very quickly once people put their minds to this thing and were told that they couldn't do it online. They had to do it in person. That galvanized a whole bunch of people, Curt.
Yeah, you're seeing the Southwest come around. Now, I'd like to say it's just a pure movement, but as you just said earlier, it's all about the money. And when you have Nevada just having people cross the border and loading up, similar like you saw in Massachusetts with all the dispensaries on the New York border, I think Arizona caught on to how much money they were losing on the roundabout exit turnaround, and they're going to get in the game for money.
It's all about that almighty dollar. And speaking of which, there was a huge weed bust at the Canadian border this week. A truck hauling nearly 5 tons. That's almost 10,000 pounds. It's one of the largest weed busts ever. And the driver is now facing life in prison. The math works out to about $20 million worth of weed. And the 26-year-old male who was the driver of that truck, well, guess what? He was carrying 55 storage containers, all packed with cannabis. An X-ray taken of the truck showed some inconsistencies on his manifest. Again, not the brightest move, with Ontario plates, full tractor trailer, just about midnight, coming from Canada to the United States. Oops.
I mean, generally, Snoop had to cancel his pool party that weekend when that truck got stopped. So, yeah, you know, sometimes you don't get the brightest guys doing those runs for, let's just say, cannabis growers that are not licensed in both countries. So, we'll see more of that. And speaking of Canada, Jimmy, let's jump right up to Solomon Israel of MJBizDaily International with our Canadian business report.
I'm Solomon Israel from Marijuana Business Daily International, and this is the Weed Talk News Canadian Cannabis Report. Aurora Cannabis co-founder Terry Booth has left the company's board of directors. He stepped down as Aurora's CEO in February. Former board president Steve Dobler also stepped down from the Aurora board recently. The company is cutting jobs and closing facilities as part of a corporate transformation plan. Auxly Cannabis has become the latest Canadian marijuana firm to scale back its international operations. The company owns a majority stake in an Uruguayan cannabis producer. That subsidiary completed a harvest this year, but Auxly says it won't be planting in the coming season. Back here in Canada, Alberta's government-operated online cannabis store is pausing sales of cannabis-infused chocolates for more than 2 months. AlbertaCannabis.org said it made the move to prevent customers from receiving melted chocolate shipments during the hot summer months. But sales of cannabis-infused chocolate will continue at Alberta's nearly 500 bricks-and-mortar cannabis outlets. You can read those stories and more at MJBizDaily.com. That's it for this week. I'm Solomon Israel from Marijuana Business Daily.
MJBizDaily wrapped up 2 virtual conferences this past week. Chris Walsh was just one of the many speakers featured in the new online virtual conference world. Will the future be clicking on a logo, visiting a booth online, and having live chats with marijuana companies? Perhaps. Time will tell.
The cannabis world lost 2 legends in the movement to legalize last week. Former Harvard professor and researcher Dr. Lester Greenspoon passed away at the age of 92. You know, he was one of the first academics who was pro-cannabis after researching the science of the plant and publishing the book Marijuana Reconsidered in 1971. Yes, I even remember when that book came out. That book drew the ire of President Richard Nixon, who called the Harvard professor a clown. Isn't that like calling the pot black? I don't know, one of those cliches. Dr. Marion McNabb, a respected cannabis researcher here in Massachusetts, interviewed Lester just last year. He was an inspiration to her.
You know, he paved the way for academics to have freedom and trying to understand the plant and understand the science around it. And he also was really paramount in legalization and the movement of legalization. We're very honored to, have such a brave academic leader. And he's inspired me deeply. I got into cannabis, understanding his work, and really grateful to have been connected to the Grinspoon family by Stephen Mandile.
The second person who passed away on June 25th was a Parkinson's patient named Larry Smith. He was also a former police officer from South Dakota. This video has been viewed 3.8 million times. It demonstrates the positive effects cannabis had on Larry Smith's condition as he goes from seizures to calm in just a few minutes of taking cannabis tinctures. South Dakota has one of the nation's toughest cannabis laws. And on this week's Weed Talk Now podcast, Curt and I got to talk with Melissa Metley, who is heading up the fight for medicinal marijuana on the South Dakota ballot in November.
I did a TV show with his wife, Betty, but he lost his battle with Parkinson's, and his story for people, especially like my elderly mother who was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's, I sat her down and I said, Mom, I know you're old and you're so stuck in your ways, but look, Larry is also your age and he has had this great life, but look at him and he's a former police officer and, he served 25 years in Connecticut on a police department up there, owned a bakery in South Dakota. But those stories are what make people think. And especially when you have children with epilepsy or Dravet syndrome, you're looking for anything. And the more stories that are out there, those patient zeros are so important.
Now let's look at all the social equity activity out there all over the United States. Los Angeles is changing its practice of giving out licenses in order to help the social equity applicants after recognizing they screwed up, Curt. They did. And I guess it's one thing to recognize you're screwed up, because that's the first step to actually making a change. And that's what's happening in LA.
Yeah, and it's all good. You're seeing the same thing in San Francisco when High Times tried to get that really prime location next to the Chanel store, and it was a social equity applicant. San Francisco took a look at how these licenses are being given out, and then sold 51% to much bigger investors. So it's all for the good. This transition, the social equity and economic empower applicants were supposed to get a head start and a bigger slice of the pie. So maybe with the BLM and things that are going now in the world, we're actually going to correct that and make it the way it was supposed to be done.
And in Colorado, Governor Jared Polis is now cleared to pardon low-level cannabis possession criminals, setting aside a number of those licenses that are in fact designated for those people and including other applicants. So again, another legal state recognizing that perhaps we need to give an opportunity for those who are most impacted on the war on drugs. Another step in the right direction, Curt.
Yeah, and what people don't know is that for these applicants, these legal marijuana applications, if you had a felony or a drug conviction in 7 or 10 years, in some states, you were ineligible, which is ridiculous when you kind of do the whole chicken or the egg. So it's nice to see Colorado, Denver, those areas who started the movement, recognizing that a mistake in your past for this exact same thing we're legally selling may be no longer a valid reason to deny someone access to the legal market and the business side.
Again, perhaps a reflection of what's going on the streets all over the United States with these protests and Black Lives Matter. So now let's go to Washington, D.C. to Phil Adams, one of the co-hosts of the Vote Pro podcast. He's our D.C. correspondent. Phil?
Hi, Phil Adams from Vote Pro podcast, here with this week's Weed Talk News D.C. report. The House of Representatives approved legislation on Wednesday allowing researchers in states where marijuana is legal to study cannabis legally purchased from dispensaries. Current law allows scientists to use only government-grown cannabis from a single federally authorized source. A group of House Democrats are now calling for an impeachment inquiry against Attorney General William Barr in the wake of last week's House subcommittee hearing, in which Barr was accused of ordering inappropriate investigations of several cannabis industry mergers. The resolution, introduced by Representative Steve Cohen of Tennessee, claims that the investigations were politically motivated and reflect Barr's own personal animus toward the cannabis industry. Turning to news from just beyond the Beltway, cannabis has now been decriminalized in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Instead of facing up to 30 days in jail and a $500 fine for possession of half an ounce of cannabis or less, as of July 1st, Virginians found with 1 ounce or less will now be subject to no more than a $25 fine. And in the neighboring state of Maryland, the Court of Appeals has ruled unanimously that the smell of marijuana alone no longer constitutes probable cause to search someone. While police in Maryland can still search your car, the ruling prohibits them from searching your person unless they find evidence of a crime other than simple marijuana possession. That's the Weed Talk News DC report for this week. I'm Phil Adams from Vote Pro Podcast.
And Jimmy, we have new predictions. MJBizDaily has their new numbers out. Legal cannabis in America, 37 billion by 2023, and that does not include a federal change in the law. What do you think of that number, Jimmy? High or low? You going over or under?
Oh, I'm going to go over because I actually think I'm optimistic. I think we're going to make some changes at the federal level if and when we see a change of the leadership of the United States in November. And I think you know which way I'm leaning on that, Curt.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. We're going to see Maine coming on eventually here with rec. We're going to probably get through this COVID one way or another in the next 6 months, depending on what state you're in. So you're going to see reopening of dispensaries. Walk-ins will be open not just by car and drive-through. So I'm going to go over 37 billion by 2023 as well, and that's not without a federal change. If that happens, then I'm going higher. I'm taking the over.
Yeah, well, like Sly Stone used to say, we want to take you higher. That's what they want to do here in the cannabis world. We'll make it happen. And finally today, a weird weed coincidence in the city of Chicago. The first adult-use recreational dispensary will open inside the city limits. Its location, 923 West Weed Street in the Ranch Triangle neighborhood. That's right, Curt, a dispensary on Weed Street, not Easy Street, Weed Street.
I wonder what their marketing team will come up with for that one. Because boy, I could see some great shirts with you know how the street sign right on the shirt and the little address. Yeah, that would you could make that one work forever.
Absolutely. Their CEO actually said it was just a coincidence that the street happened to be named Weed Street. They had hoped to get the 420 Weed Street address, but of course that was not available. You just can't make this stuff up, Curt, huh?
Yeah, it was a good week, and hopefully with a holiday coming up, people will enjoy recreation or medical cannabis safely.
That'll pretty much wrap it up for another edition of Weed Talk News. I'm Jimmy Young, the founder of Pro Cannabis Media.
And I'm Curt Dalton, the founder of Cannabis.net.
Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Use it responsibly, and especially if you're using fireworks. Happy 4th of July, everybody. We'll talk to you next week on Weed Talk News.
I mean, what could go wrong?
Weed Talk Now, Weed Talk News, and In the Weeds are all available on most major podcast distributors like iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and our friends at clnsmedia.com and our flagship, Cannabis.net. So subscribe, share, and like our videos on all the social media networks out there, including LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the WeedTube, and YouTube. Weed Talk and In the Weeds are two productions of Pro Cannabis Media supported by Revolutionary Clinics, one of the top medical cannabis dispensaries in the Massachusetts area, now with 3 locations in Greater Boston, 2 in Cambridge and 1 on Broadway in Somerville. Rev Clinics has a patient-first mission. They will customize your needs as a medical patient with the proper titration and combination of strains, flavors, and products. Rev Clinics, where the patient comes first.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.